Okay, so today we're going to kind of dive into this world of Jack Abramoff. And this guy went from, like, Hollywood film producer to
Oh, wow.
like the center of this
Yeah.
massive political scandal.
Hmm.
It's kind of one of those things where it's like, was he like a visionary strategist, or was he just a master manipulator? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
was he gifted, or was he a grifter?
That's the question.
Right.
It's a great question.
So we've got court documents, articles, all this stuff chronicling his rise and fall. We even have excerpts from his own book.
Right.
So we're going to go from the early days to
Okay.
the height of his power,
Mm-hmm.
and then, of course, the dramatic downfall.
I think what's really fascinating about Abramoff's story is that it's not just about ambition and influence, but it's also kind of a study in how somebody can really blur those lines between right and wrong. So to really understand it, I think we have to start at the beginning with his early life and his political roots.
All right, so let's rewind the clock a little bit.
Okay.
Abramoff, he wasn't born into this world of politics, right? He was born in Atlantic City,
Okay.
and he actually found some early success in, like, a totally different field, Hollywood.
Wow.
He was producing these action films. Like,
wow.
back in 1989, he did this anti-communist flick called Red Scorpion.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah. Even during that time, though, you can kind of see glimpses of the ambition, the deal-making, all that stuff that would define his later career.
Yeah.
But it wasn't really until his college years, when he was at Brandeis University, that his path to political influence really started to take shape.
Yeah, so what happened at Brandeis? Was he just some, college student activist, or was there something more to it?
No, he was far from your average college kid. Like, he quickly rose through the ranks of the college Republicans. He got elected treasurer. He was organizing campaigns.
Wow. But there's kind of this other side to it. Some sources, they describe him as actually being pretty ruthless in consolidating power within the organization.
Interesting.
He wasn't content to just participate, you know what I mean?
Right.
He wanted control.
So even early on, there were kind of these signs of, that desire for power and maybe a willingness to bend the rules a little bit.
Yeah, and that becomes more and more relevant as his story unfolds. After college, he gets involved with the College Republican National Committee, the CRNC.
Okay.
That just further solidified his connections with all these future political heavy hitters. And this is where we really see the seeds of what would become known as the Abramoff machine. This was this powerful network of lobbyists, former congressional aides, and a lot of them would later face legal trouble.
Yeah. So we've got this, like, ambitious, connected young guy, this knack for, like, deal making, but maybe a few red flags in terms of his methods. How does this all translate into this lobbying career?
Well, he lands at this pretty prestigious firm, Preston Gates, Ellis and Ruvelis Meads, LLP.
Wow.
And it was there that he really got his first taste of representing the interests of Native American tribes. Specifically, he was involved with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, lobbying for their gambling interests.
Okay.
And that was kind of the beginning of what would become a major focus for him, representing Native American clients.
And this is where things really start to get interesting.
This is where things get interesting. This is where Team Abramoff really comes together. He joins forces with Michael Scanlon, and together they assemble this team made up largely of, again, former congressional aides.
Oh, wow.
And their tactics. Aggressive. I mean, they showered politicians with lavish gifts, campaign contributions, all expenses paid trips.
Oh, wow.
All in the name of securing favorable legislation for their clients.
So, like, golf outings at, like, fancy resorts, tickets to sporting events, that sort of thing?
Yes.
Sounds like they were living the high life on somebody else's time.
And that somebody else, of course, was the Native American tribes that they were supposed to be representing.
Right.
They were secretly splitting profits, in a lot of cases grossly overcharging their clients. They even had a name for their scheme. Gimme Five.
Gimme Five.
Gimme Five. Shell companies, complex financial transactions, all to hide that money trail.
They weren't even trying to be subtle.
I know.
But to really understand how they pulled this off, I think we need to look at some specific examples.
Let's look at the Louisiana Coushatta tribe.
Okay.
They secured a very lucrative contract with the Coushatta by promising to protect the tribe from competition. They came up with this Texas menace strategy.
Okay.
It was basically convincing the Coushatta that this proposed casino in Texas was a threat to their livelihood.
So how did they fight this menace? Did they go through, like, legitimate channels?
They used everything. grassroots campaigns, lobbying efforts against competing casinos. They even brought in Christian evangelical groups to speak out against gambling expansion. It was really well coordinated, very effective.
Wow.
But built on deception.
Right.
So they managed to block the Texas casino.
Okay.
But here's where it gets shady.
Yeah.
After successfully lobbying against that casino, he turns around and pitches a similar deal to the Tigo tribe of Texas.
So he's playing both sides.
Exactly.
Wow.
He approaches the Tigo tribe. They'd been forced to shut down their casino with a plan to fight the very same ban that he had helped put in place, promising to restore their gambling rights. Clear conflict of interest.
Yeah.
He was playing both sides against the middle for his own financial gain.
Wow, that takes some serious manipulation. But his influence didn't stop with the Native American tribes, right?
Yeah. It extended all the way to the Northern Mariana Islands, also known as the CNMI.
Okay.
He lobbied for the CNMI government to keep these exemptions from U.S. labor and immigration laws.
Wow. Now, this benefited the garment industry over there, but it perpetuated these exploitative working conditions for many. And he even arranged this all-expenses-paid trip for Tom DeLay, who was then the House Majority Whip, to Saipan, trying to influence his stance on labor reform.
So, I mean, we're seeing a pattern here, right? Lavish gifts, trips, questionable ethics, all to influence powerful people and secure these outcomes that are favorable for his clients and, of course, for his own bank account. But eventually, this house of cards had to fall, right?
Oh, yeah.
It had to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It did.
So it seems like Abramoff was able to build this really effective network of influence. You mentioned Team Abramoff before the break. Who were some of the other key players, in this inner circle? And how were they able to help him pull off all these schemes?
Yeah, so Team Abramoff was mostly made up of these, former congressional aides, people who really knew the ins and outs of Washington, had these direct connections to those in power. And that inside knowledge was crucial.
Yeah. Probably the most notable figure was Tony Rudy. He was an aide to Tom DeLay, who was House Majority Leader at the time. Rudy later pleaded guilty to conspiring with Abramoff.
So we're not just talking about lobbyists here. We're talking about people who previously worked within the government, basically using that knowledge to game the system.
Exactly. And it wasn't just politicians and their aides who got caught up in all this.
Right.
Abramoff also had close ties to lobbyists like Kevin Ring, who worked with him on several tribal lobbying efforts and was later convicted on corruption charges.
Wow.
And it just shows you how interconnected everything was. I mean, this was a complex system of favors, gifts, and ultimately greed.
Greed. Let's talk about the money. How much did Abramoff and his associates actually make from all of this?
The amounts are honestly staggering. Court documents show that they collected millions of dollars in fees from their tribal clients, and it wasn't just lobbying fees, right? Abramoff was also using his influence to funnel money to different nonprofit organizations, a lot of which he had control over.
So he's using nonprofit to enrich himself and his associates. That's bold.
One example is the Capital Athletic Foundation. This was an organization that was supposed to be dedicated to, supporting athletic programs.
Right.
They got millions from Abramoff's tribal clients, but very little of that money actually went towards its intended purpose. It was used for lavish trips, expensive gifts, even personal expenses for Abramoff and his inner circle.
Wow.
A clear case of using charitable organizations as a front for personal gain.
So we have this clear pattern of manipulation, influence peddling, and misuse of funds. What was the fallout from all of this, aside from the convictions and the prison sentences? How did this scandal impact Washington as a whole?
Yeah, well, the Abramoff scandal really sent shockwaves through Washington, and it led to calls for some pretty major reforms. I mean, lawmakers realized that the existing system was just way too vulnerable to this kind of abuse. It eventually led to the passage of the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007.
Okay.
And that was aimed at increasing transparency and curbing the influence of lobbyists.
So this act was a direct response to the Abramoff scandal.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about what this act actually did?
So basically the act, it imposed these stricter limits on the types of gifts that lawmakers could receive. It also increased transparency requirements for lobbyists. So, they had to disclose more information about their activities and who they were working for.
Right.
And it established new ethics rules for members of Congress, which were designed to prevent conflicts of interest and curb undue influence.
So it sounds like it was a pretty significant step towards actually cleaning up the system. But did these reforms really change the culture in Washington? Or did lobbyists and, people who are seeking to influence politicians just find new ways to kind of work around these rules?
I think that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, the influence of money in politics is still a huge issue, and some would argue that these reforms didn't go far enough.
Right. And it's interesting, Abramoff himself has actually been quite vocal about the need for further reforms.
He has.
He's even written a book, Capital Punishment, The Hard Truth About Washington Corruption from America's Most Notorious Lobbyists, where he details his experiences and really advocates for these greater ethical standards in government.
Yeah, but it's tough to say whether his remorse is genuine or if it's just, some calculated attempt to kind of salvage his reputation.
Right. It's like a fascinating psychological question.
Yeah.
How does somebody who claims to be deeply religious, a man of principle, end up engaging in this really blatant, unethical behavior?
Yeah, and in his own writing and interviews, Abramoff gives a few different explanations for his actions. He claims he got caught up in this culture of corruption that was already there in Washington, that the lines between right and wrong just became blurred.
So he's saying that the system itself is to blame? That everybody was doing it, so he didn't see anything wrong with it?
Kind of, yeah. He describes this lobbying culture where lavish gifts and campaign contributions and personal connections were just seen as the cost of doing business.
But does that really excuse his behavior? I mean, he was clearly the one orchestrating a lot of these schemes.
Yeah.
Exploiting his clients, enriching himself in the process.
Absolutely. And, some people see Abramoff's explanations as just attempts to deflect blame and minimize his own responsibility.
Right.
And then others believe that he maybe genuinely convinced himself that what he was doing was justified.
Okay.
Kind of like a form of self-deception fueled by ambition and this desire to win at any cost.
It's a complex puzzle. It makes you think. Was he always a con man, a grifter at heart?
Right.
Or did he start with good intentions and just get corrupted by the system?
It's hard to say. I think to really get a better understanding, we need to look at some of the people who were caught up in his web.
Okay.
The people who enabled his schemes, and those who ultimately brought him down.
Let's do that. We're talking about whether Abramoff was, always corrupt or if he was kind of a product of this broken system. But to really get a sense of the guy, we need to look at the human impact of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, while Abramoff's story is often told in terms of, political moves and financial gains, it's important to remember that, there were real people who were affected by what he was doing.
Yeah, you're talking about the Native American tribes that he was representing.
Exactly. I mean, they're the ones who really paid the price for his ambition. A lot of these tribes, they were already struggling financially.
Right.
And they looked at Abramoff as somebody who could really fight for their interests in Washington.
Okay.
They trusted him, and he totally betrayed that trust.
So he was taking advantage of their vulnerability. It's almost like a classic con man move, preying on people who are desperate.
Exactly. And think about it. It wasn't just the tribes themselves. I mean, think about the individual members of those communities.
Yeah.
The people whose lives were really upended by all of this. Hopes, dreams, financial security, all of that jeopardized by Abramoff's actions.
So it's not just some abstract political game, right? This is real life with real consequences.
Absolutely.
But how did it all end for Abramoff? Who were the people who finally kind of exposed all of this?
Well, I mean, there were a few different things. Investigative journalists, they played a huge role in uncovering his schemes and bringing them to light.
Right.
And then you have the whistleblowers.
Yeah.
The people within his own circle who finally decided, okay, we got to cooperate with the authorities.
So even within his team, there were people who had a conscience.
Yeah.
They realized it was wrong.
They did. And of course, you can't forget the prosecutors, the investigators. I mean, they worked so hard to build a case against him. They followed the money, exposed the shell companies, just meticulously pieced together all the evidence that led to his conviction.
Sounds like a huge undertaking.
Oh, it was a real David and Goliath situation, but it shows you that even the most powerful, well-connected people, they can be held accountable.
Yeah, so in the end, the system worked.
It did.
Justice was served. But what are the lessons here? What can we learn from the Abramoff scandal?
I think it's a cautionary tale. It's about power, greed, unchecked ambition. It shows us how even people with strong values, they can get tempted by wealth and influence.
Yeah.
It also highlights the importance of transparency,
Right.
and accountability in government.
And maybe it makes us question our own judgment,
Right.
How do we get better at telling the difference between these true visionaries and the people who are just, master manipulators?
I mean, that's a question for all of us, right? We have to think critically.
Yeah.
We can't just take things at face value. We have to look deeper, examine the motives and the actions of the people who are trying to influence us.
So was Jack Abramoff a visionary or a con artist? A gifted strategist or a master manipulator?
Yeah.
It's tough to say. Maybe he was a little bit of both. But one thing's for sure. His story reminds us that the line between, like, real innovation and exploitation, it can be blurry.
It can be really blurry. And that the pursuit of success, no matter how, how noble the goal might seem, it should never come at the expense of ethical principles.
Right. As we try to navigate this world where charisma and controversy are constantly bumping up against each other, Abramoff's story is a reminder. We have to stay vigilant. We have to ask the tough questions.
Yeah.
Hold those in power accountable for what they do.
Absolutely. Because ultimately it's up to each of us to decide, are we going to be seduced by a good story? Or are we going to demand transparency, integrity, a real commitment to the greater good?
Well said. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.